What's going on, everybody? Thank you for joining me today. This is sort of a spontaneous thing. When I woke up this morning, I did not have any plans of doing a live broadcast. But I've been sort of outfitting this 1969 Airstream trailer as an office, and I got this mic yesterday. And, one of the things I've been wanting to do since spending so much time the last 6 months being interviewed by other people on their channels, their podcasts, their YouTube channels about, issues to do with God and faith and all that stuff. I really wanted to start doing some conversations of my own. And I've been planning it and trying to figure out like how exactly to get started. And then today also, I've just sort of like, well, maybe I just need to start. And I thought about doing something with just me, myself, talking to the camera. And I just found that these conversations take on a whole new life when you have someone to have a conversation with, and rather than me just talking and then maybe reading comments, which I'm already seeing some, which is cool. So I reached out to a friend of mine. His name's Logan, and he runs a Twitter channel, a Twitter account called Beyond Belief, and he also blogs. And I just invited him to come on and talk about some of these issues with me. And so I just want to welcome Logan to the show. Logan, what's up, man?
Hi there. How you doing? You well?
I'm doing great, man. I realized I just said to the show like I have a show. Like this is like
you kind of do.
Well, this is the first time I've ever done this, so I'm sort of learning on the go. So any of you watching, if we have technical difficulties, it's not Logan's fault. It's my fault. If you want to, you could say it's divine intervention. But so far everything's working great. And I mean, I had thought about wanting to have a conversation like this with you for a while. And then today on Twitter, you were responding to some thoughts from a YouTube apologist named Braxton Hunter. Yeah. And I saw that one of your responses just briefly touched on how you described the problem of divine absence, I think you called it. And I sort of referred to that as the problem of divine hiddenness, which is sort of the idea that like if God is real, like where is he and why isn't he more obvious? And so that's been a really central thing for me. And so I thought maybe we could kick that thought around and see where it goes. But before we do that, maybe if you don't mind telling people kind of where you're from, what your background is, and how you found yourself to be where you're at with regards to faith and belief and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm from the UK, which is fun. So it's 8 p.m. here. Just had dinner. So I'm quite new to the whole sort of post-Christian thing, because I sort of found myself in, like you say, this kind of Twitter community, which I wasn't really aware of like a few months back. But I mean, it's always difficult to pin down the exact timings. But basically, earlier this year, I kind of reached a crux where I discovered the kind of like the things that I sort of believed before, like in the Christian faith that I was brought up in and that I studied. I realized that actually it didn't make as much sense as I thought it did. Mm-hmm. And for a while, I think those kind of questions were bubbling under the surface, as they often do. And then it just came to the point where I kind of actually thought, well, it's not so much just a matter of having questions or doubts within the Christian faith, but actually it's like stepping through the door outside of the house and looking at it from the outside and realizing, actually, I'm not sure I actually have a Christian faith. To begin with, the fundamentals sort of don't seem to be there, let alone all of the furnishings and all of that. So, yeah, I then started blogging basically as a way. It was quite therapeutic in a way.
I relate to that for sure.
Yeah, and I thought, if no one reads it, that's fine. Like, it helps me anyway. And then I thought, I don't know if that's quite true. Like, I do want people to read it.
Yeah.
So, so I thought, where can I sort of publish this or get people to see it? I thought, do I find like a forum or something? And I thought, it's not the noughties. People don't people don't go on forums anymore.
The naughties, like as in the knots, as in the 2000s.
Yeah,
I've literally never heard that term.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? 'Cause
And I love it.
You got the 20s and the 30s and stuff.
It makes sense.
Even like the teeny, it doesn't really. Yeah, but so anyway, so I don't know if anyone really does forums anymore. And I thought Twitter. So I made like a Twitter account so I could sort of put this stuff out there. But I actually started finding that before long, I just quite enjoyed being on Twitter anyway. And like having conversations with people that had been in similar experiences. And when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I actually quite enjoyed doing like apologetic stuff online and having debates between Christians and atheists. But of course, back then, I was doing it from a Christian perspective. So at first, it felt kind of weird to be doing it from the other side and actually being like, oh, these arguments that I used to say myself don't really make as much sense as I thought they did back then. And yeah, so since then it's just been quite fun getting involved in that kind of post-Christian or ex-evangelical or all these other kind of names community, which is enjoyed that.
There are so many different labels, deconstruction, deconversion, ex-Christian, post-Christian, and I never really know what to do with those terms because I always feel like they carry different connotations for different people, and I never really know, like, are any of them accurate with where I'm at, at the moment, and I also tend to feel like my perception of what I really believe about things almost changes day to day, right? Yeah. Because I find myself in the place where, like, I was a Christian my whole life. I began to have serious doubts and started, processing that emotionally and intellectually, and then getting to a place where I felt like the honest thing to do was to come forward and say that I don't think I believe this stuff, and yet I still have moments where I sort of want to believe parts of it at least, and so I find myself sort of stuck between these two things, because what you see sometimes is some people who stop, believing or walk away from Christianity will get very angry and very bitter and very quickly flip over to this sense of, like, I'm going to attack religion and attack Christianity, and that's my new identity. And I didn't feel that. And from what I see you posting, I don't sense that in your tone either. I mean, you're coming at it. I mean, you make pointed points sometimes, but it never feels mean-spirited to me, and that's something that I really appreciate about your approach. Do you ever have feelings like that, where there's parts of you that you sort of wish that you could believe aspects of Christianity still, or like how or is it just like that was overwhelmingly not a healthy thing in your life and you're happy to be done with it? Like, how do you feel about all that?
Yeah, because I mean, similar to you, I think that it does change. I mean, so when I first kind of left it behind, as it were, I think I did have the more bitter phase, as it were. And some of the friends and my family that I spoke to can probably testify that when I was having these conversations, they weren't like armchair philosophy. I'm like, well, maybe God doesn't exist, but ponder this, if you will. Yeah. It was quite emotional. It was because so much of me was kind of invested in it and tied up in it as well. And actually, I think a big part of what did lead to me sort of not being a Christian anymore is actually I realized I didn't quite like the character of God that I saw in the Bible. And for a few reasons. I mean, one is what you see, like the quite obvious ones that people point to, like, the sort of violence in the Old Testament and just sort of a lot of the things that God commands. But also, I think for me, sort of being gay meant that suddenly this picture I had of God was kind of someone who was against me. It was no longer the classic Christian, like, God is on your side, nothing can separate, He is for you. Suddenly I thought, well, if he's for me, then why why like this? Like
Right.
why has he got a problem with this sort of area of my life? And therefore, like, my whole idea of God kind of changed. Not overnight, but suddenly I realized that when I thought of God, I didn't think of like loving Father or all of those other things, but I had these other pictures kind of tied up in that. So in a sense, I don't necessarily have a huge desire to believe in that God.
Right. That makes sense. That's really interesting because I do feel like, just for me personally, like my dad is incredibly loving, incredibly kind, incredibly gentle. And so, like, deep down, when I picture God the Father, that's what I picture. And that doesn't sound like the way that I picture that in my head, that sounds pretty good to me, you know? And so I think it's that image of God that I sometimes like, I feel like a desire to believe in. But I'm with you. Like, you read the Bible, and there's a lot of places where God does not seem to have that character necessarily.
Yeah.
And so there's problematic areas. You know, I'm sure that there are people that would feel that my sort of image of God that I prefer to think of, or probably the one that I thought of the whole time I identified as a Christian. Some people would probably say that that was an inaccurate picture of God, and it was de-emphasizing his justice or his wrath or something. But
nice bits.
Yeah, but you know, so let's talk about the divine hiddenness thing. I noticed that it's not something that Christian apologists address directly very often. They talk about arguments for God from design, the cosmological argument, the moral argument, like all you know, the fine-tuning argument, all these different arguments for God. And the problem of evil comes up pretty regularly, but the problem of divine hiddenness, which feels related but not quite the same, doesn't come up directly so much. And I've discovered that for me, I thought the problem of evil was my biggest sort of stumbling block to belief. But I actually, when I think about it more, I think it's actually the divine hiddenness problem, because it's this sort of question of like, if God is real, where is he? And, you know, in the Bible, we read stories of God intervening in people's lives and being willing to break the laws of nature in order to help those he loves. And so if you believe in the God of the Bible, then you believe that God is capable of intervening. And he does. He decides to intervene at times. And then we see the suffering in the world today, or maybe we experience horrible suffering and we go like, well, why is God not intervening now and here? And that's a really big one for me. Do you feel like that was an aspect of your sort of, whatever we want to call it, deconstruction, or sort of how did that aspect show up for you in your life?
Yeah, so, well, actually, because I was doing a sort of Instagram Q&A earlier, and one of my friends asked a similar question about, like, what kind of the experience and theology, like how they kind of interacted. And I think for me, it's difficult to say experiencing divine hiddenness, because it's not like,
right.
Oh, yeah, so when didn't you experience God? Right? It's just,
right.
It's not really a question, but yeah, not experiencing God, at least. I think it meant that I didn't have something to fall back on.
Yeah.
Because when you have all of these kind of theological questions, like whether it's about the Bible or, you know, about suffering and evil, I noticed that for a lot of Christians, they can chat about these things, but it doesn't seem to bother them that much, because they can sort of rely or fall back on this idea that, well, you know, I have a relationship with God, like I know that he's good, and therefore there's kind of like this idea of trust that it's all fine. I think for me, I never had that to fall back on. So when I had the difficult theological questions, I didn't really have a foundation that I could work at them from with any kind of like hermeneutic of trust or however you'd put it. But also I think it is having that experience of absence that also led me to those questions. Because I think if people felt sort of secure and comforted in their relationship with God, then perhaps they wouldn't feel the need to ask these questions or to look into these areas. They would just think, well, it is what it is. Like, it works for me. But I think it's when those things don't work for you that you then start to ask the questions of what is going on here, like, and then other questions about God and his nature and character that come up. So I think it interacted quite a lot with a lot of my other sort of questions, and it meant that I didn't have what maybe a lot of other Christians would have had to work at it from.
Yeah. What I mean for you, I mean, I know we've talked privately about this issue, but you sort of came out twice, right? You sort of came out as gay and then came out as a non-believer, and you came out as gay first, right?
Yeah.
And how much time was in between those two events?
Yeah, so I came out as gay aged 18, so
Okay.
it was back in 2013. It was Christmas Eve. I thought, why not? So
Was that like a Christmas present to yourself? Like, I'm gonna be honest with myself and everyone else.
Yeah, no, I was so excited I had to unwrap it the day before. But I don't know quite why it worked out though. I think I'd started a youth work internship that I was doing, and I think I was back for the Christmas holidays, and I met up with a friend. So I think it might have just worked out at being around that sort of time. But yeah, so that was about 7 years ago, I suppose. Since again, it's a lot of these things. It's difficult to pin an exact date.
Yeah.
When you make these realizations and stuff. So I suppose having like a moment of coming out, as it were, is quite handy to pinpoint that. But yeah, sort of, a good chunk of time between.
So what was life like for you then, when you were you had come out as gay, but you still were identifying as a Christian? Were you a part of a church that was affirming, or I don't think you were, right?
No, I mean, and again, see, one of the things that I think is quite different that I've noticed between like churches in the UK and in the States is that I feel like even if they're not affirming in the UK, they're still very polite about it.
Yeah.
So from what I mean, I've not been to America, and so I can't say what it's like from experience, but from hearing other people's stories, and even just from what I've seen online, it seems like a really unpleasant place to be. Like if you're gay and or if you're just gay generally and in the wrong part. Whereas in England, like not many sort of evangelical or Church of England churches are affirming, like theologically. But for the most part, for them, it's more like an awkward thing. They're
like, we'll steer clear of that one.
Yeah. And it becomes more of a matter of, because they don't do the horrible things of, oh, well, clearly it was a choice, or, it's a sin to be gay. Like it usually becomes a bit more subtle. It's more like, oh, no, it's okay that you are gay as long as you don't sort of act on it,
Right.
So as long as you have a lifetime of singleness, like God's cool with that.
Right.
So it takes on that kind of more subtle form. So I said in my blog post about it, I was saying, when I came back after Christmas, I thought, I'll be honest with my youth team that I worked with about it. I'm not sure why, but it seemed like the right thing to do. And I told the youth pastor, and he was kind of like, great.
Yeah.
which is nice, because it made me think like, oh, I suppose it isn't such a big deal. But nonetheless, we still decided like it's probably a good idea to chat to the vicar so that he's aware of it. And so I remember we went up to his office. It's kind of like an awkward conversation to have at any time.
I don't see how it couldn't be. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was there. It was me. It was the youth pastor that I was working with and the vicar. And I think we had a bit of idle chat. And then the vicar sort of asked me, "Oh, can you tell me what you told the youth pastor, like in your own words?" And I was like, I need to break the ice here, because it's just It's too much. So I said, I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. I just told him that I was from Uruguay. Um, but we chatted, and the thing is, at that stage in my life, it was more about understanding who I was.
Mm-hmm.
The questions of like relationships hadn't really come into my mind at that time, because I feel like when you're in a village church,
Yeah.
With like it's a small sort of congregation of 100 people or so who are largely 70 plus. Like dating isn't really the first thing on your mind. So it was kind of more a matter of understanding like my identity and trying to reconcile that. And so I feel like having a couple of years of doing that was quite helpful before I then thought about the practical things of how it worked out. But then I went to Bible college and again, Bible college, I think in the UK is a bit different from the States. It's not so much like the fundamentalist kind of scary place to be.
Well, and I relate to that because Canada's much more like the UK culturally, or maybe somewhere in between the UK and America probably. But yeah, in Canada where I grew up, it was very, very similar to what you're describing. So yeah,
it's just a bit more sort of that secular kind of liberal ethos generally, I think. And so yeah, the Bible college I went to, it was validated by like a regular university, so it wasn't like a completely sort of like church-run thing, but it was like an independent sort of college, and it was quite a conservative place to be. For like, one of the things I was so shocked about was when I arrived, there were like debates about whether women could lead churches and stuff.
Right.
And I thought, like, I don't know if I was just sort of just not aware of that at all, but I thought that had been settled. Like, women are people too.
Right.
Like, they can have the same leadership.
And then they point. And then they point you to
First
Timothy. And
well, yeah, I mean all of those. I mean, there's quite. To be fair, one of the things I realized, there's quite a lot that you can point people to in the Bible, like to be anti sort of gay or sort of women in leadership and all these kind of things.
Yes.
They're not short of like literature, like to support.
Right. Well, and that's been. I mean, that's been sort of one of the things that I've wrestled with is that in my journey, like I think initially I was more thinking that I'd probably end up in the progressive Christian camp because I had feelings on social issues that weren't really aligned with the more conservative Christians, but I was like, I don't think this means that I'm not a Christian, right? Like, I remember when the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in 2007. I remember feeling like that was a good thing. Like instantly, my initial gut reaction was like, "Hey, that's good, right?" And then I realized that I couldn't say that publicly because I was a Christian musician, and my career depended on me not saying that. And in fact, there was another Christian musician, Dan Hazeltine of a group named Jars of Clay, that he when that ruling came down, he was in Australia. He tweeted that he was celebrating it or supporting it, and then he got on a plane from Sydney to LA, I think, and by the time he landed, his band's career was more or less over.
Right.
And so I may not be getting all those details right, but that's how I remember hearing it. And I remember seeing that, and I was like, oh, instinct confirmed. Like, I can't say this publicly. And I think for a while I thought, like, well, maybe I'll end up being sort of in the progressive Christian camp, and people like Rob Bell and Richard Rohr were sort of becoming more known, and I was like, okay. But as I got more and more into it, I was like, man, I actually sort of agree with some Christian apologists that in order to keep the Bible as something that is inerrant and still keep these sort of more social progressive leanings that I have, in order to keep both, I have to do some real pretzel work on some of these verses, right? Like twisting things around. And that's something I actually tend to agree with a lot of conservative Christians on, that I'm like, yeah, I think it is difficult to twist some of these verses and say that they aren't saying what they seem to be saying. But then my response ended up being like, well, then I'm not sure I trust this book entirely, or I don't think I can look at the Bible exactly the way that I did. And that was sort of my response. I mean, did you have a similar sort of journey or process?
Yeah, and I think similarly to you, the more I was sort of going through this process of deconstruction, I think the more I was finding that my approach to the Bible was more conservative. The difference being that I just no longer agreed with it.
Right, yeah.
Because, and I think, like, because again, a lot of the people that I've spoken to, and a lot of my friends probably do have a more progressive view of like the Bible and Christianity. And part of me is like, well, that's great. Like, I don't want to, try and convert them to some kind of conservative Christianity. Like, if they're having progressive views, that's brilliant. But I think for me, it just doesn't hold up because it becomes too subjective. And I think, once you start at it, it just completely unravels because, I mean, a lot of the big issues, for example, like the people point to things like slavery or the treatment of women, like sort of throughout the Bible. And the idea being that if people are more progressive because they say, well, like we know that our God is not in favor of slavery. I think, well, how do you know that? Because if you look at the Bible, it seems that he is, or at least if he's not in favor, he doesn't really seem to have abolishing slavery at the top of his list of things to do.
Yeah.
And so it seems that actually the way that people get these values are from society. And so I always get a little bit skeptical when people say, we live by the Bible and we don't want to have our morals and stuff corrupted by the world and how society thinks. I think, well, if that's true, then you've got to start stoning a lot more people to death.
I mean, even Jesus himself in the Gospel of Mark talks about, it's better to have your, cut off, if your hand causes you to sin, it's better to have your, cut off your hand than to have your whole body go, into Gehenna, which is translated as hell. And I don't, that's a whole other topic, but
it's going a bit more universalist.
Yeah.
Lately.
So, I mean, well, I mean, honestly, I've been intrigued by the idea of Christian universalism, and I've been exploring it sort of hypothetically the last week or so and reading a lot more about it and wondering, like, is there a way in which that you could look at the Bible and be like, maybe God does save everyone? And I actually think there's a case to be made there. My favorite book on that topic is by an author named Bradley Jersak, and it's called Her Gates Will Never Be Shut. And while I believe he is a Christian universalist in the sense that I think he believes that God, Jesus will save everyone in the end. He lays out a bunch of different views, and he makes the point that in the Bible, if you want to hold any one of those views, you have to prioritize certain verses over other verses. And there's no coherent view about hell that you can hold that doesn't have verses that seem to contradict it. And I agree with that. So you could take a few different approaches to that, and this will circle back to the divine hiddenness thing that we started with and haven't talked much about. But this will circle back in that if there are multiple views that you could draw from the New Testament about what is true about heaven and hell, and they're exclusive views, they can't all be true, right? Like either Jesus saves everyone, or if you go to hell, that's annihilation, and that means you cease to exist, or there's eternal conscious torment, like, or none of those are true. But something is true, right? And so my thought on that issue is that the reason why I think it relates to divine hiddenness is because if God is real, and if the Bible is more or less true, and if Jesus did come to save us from our sins and died on the cross for our sins, the fact that we're so unclear on how that works and exactly how you get into heaven and what causes someone to go to hell, the fact that that's unclear at all means to me that if God is real, he must be casting such a wide net. Because it seems to be very, it seems to to not make sense that an all-loving God would create a choice for us that's so consequential and then make it so unclear. And so my sort of thesis at the moment is, I think that either God is not there, or he's there and he's mysterious, very mysterious, and probably better than we could imagine. And now maybe that's wishful thinking. I don't know, but it makes sense to me. So that's sort of how I see the whole divine hiddenness thing being really important, because I don't, plenty of Christians would say that they feel like God has made himself plain. And I don't feel like he has. If he's there, I don't feel like he's made himself plain. And I know a lot of other people that also feel that way, So it's like, to me, if God is real, and if this choice about eternity is on our shoulders, and if he's made it plain as day, then why are we still asking about it?
Yeah. No,
do you have thoughts on all that, or?
Yeah, well, because I think, so my understanding is that actually it's that kind of like the choice of salvation isn't really on us anyway, because I think it comes down to the nature of belief in a sense. Because even if, and I think this is where when you do get some people discussing it, I think there is actually like a different, it's not just that you believe to be saved, but I think belief is like a necessary prerequisite to be saved. So I suppose most Christians would say salvation is not just by believing in God, but it's like, it's identification with Jesus, or like, you die with him and you raised with him. But you kind of have to believe in Jesus in order to do that.
Yeah.
But kind of like on a fundamental level, like belief isn't something that we choose. And I think there's three ways that you believe something. So one is through your context. So mostly through your upbringing. So I think for the most part, it was true for me, and I think it's true for a lot of Christians I know, they believe because they were kind of brought up to believe. Like, it's how their brains are wired. Because I think most.
That was me.
My feeling is, if you ask like any church congregation, like, put your hands up if you were brought up as a Christian, you'd probably get 75-80% at least.
That's the number I was going to guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I don't deny you do get people that do convert to Christianity from other other beliefs, and that fascinates me. But the majority, I think, do come because it's what they were brought up in. So that's just how you think. I think a second one is like evidence. So if you feel like and that's kind of like what school and education is all about, is informing you about the world, the reasons behind it, and on account of that, you then come to believe certain things about how reality is. And then I think the third one is experience.
Yes.
So you believe, and I think I think it's probably more common than evidence, actually. I think you get a lot of people saying, oh, where's the evidence for God? And for me, I think it's more about, well, where's the experience of God? That's the bigger question. But the thing is, like, you can't manufacture an experience. Either it happens or it doesn't. And I think a lot of church is always trying to manufacture experience.
Well, so I have thoughts about that. I think to a degree you can manufacture it.
Okay.
Because I think that it happens a lot. I think people experience something, and so first off, I think that we experience things and we behave and we act in ways in the world, and then our rationalization of those things comes second. That's what I think. So in a lot of ways, we behave and we act in the world, and then we try to rationalize it, or we believe something deeply and then we try to articulate it, right? And so sometimes we have experiences and we try to, if we're in a Christian context, very often we will try to rationalize or articulate that experience through the framework of our belief that we've subscribed to.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And as such, sometimes we end up sort of, maybe manufacturing is not the right word, but we sort of end up interpreting certain things within that framework. So an example is, I grew up believing that the most important thing is that you have a personal relationship with God, and or a personal relationship with Jesus, which meant literally like doing all the things you would do with a person, like spending time with them, talking with them. Like, are you spending time in the Word? Are you talking to Jesus? Is he, what's he saying back to you? And there's so much that goes on in the subconscious mind. We don't know where thoughts come from sometimes. They bubble up in our mind. We don't really know where they come from. I've studied Freud and Jung quite a bit, trying to understand more about that. And very often in Christian circles, when, say, you have a thought pop into your mind that's actually really helpful, most people will, in Christian circles, many people will interpret that as God told me, or the Holy Spirit laid this on my heart. And in that sense, I actually think people do kind of manufacture things.
Definitely. When I was doing youth work, actually, we did some sessions on hearing from God, which frankly always sent a chill up my spine, because I was like, I can't do this. How on earth am I supposed to teach you about how to do it? But one of the things that it often boiled down to was, like you say, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Yeah. And I could never, that never sat right with me for those exact same reasons, because that's just how the mind works. Right. You don't decide to have a thought. You do have an inner monologue that goes on sort of all the time, but you do often have just random thoughts that pop into your mind, or memories or things like that. And so to attribute that to God can be very dangerous, which is why I always find it interesting that in church, whenever you have sessions like that, you always have these kind of safeguard measures in place. So if you're hearing from God and preaching to someone, then giving it to someone else, it's always okay, make sure it's helpful and uplifting, nothing nasty or judgmental. Right. And I can totally understand why that's there, because you can have awful things being done if that's not in place. But it also makes you think, well, basically what's happening is you're thinking a nice thing in your head, and then you're saying that to someone, which is lovely. That's just that's what in just the non-Christian world we would call encouraging someone. Yeah. But you don't need a divine voice. Right.
Well, it's even funny. Since sort of coming out, I don't feel like I'm really allowed to use the term coming out. It feels not genuine for me to use it. But since sort of openly talking about my struggle to believe in God, whenever I'm talking with someone, if they're struggling or having a hard time, and I want to offer them some comfort, I notice that I can no longer say I'm praying for you. And I stopped saying that a long time ago, because I remember making a decision years ago, I am only going to tell someone I'm praying for them if I actually will. And I tried to make that really intentional, but I notice sometimes, whenever someone's struggling and I want to offer them some encouragement, it's harder than it used to be, because I used to be able to say something spiritual or whatever, oh, God's in control, which actually God's in control is one of the scariest things you can say, because then it's well, if he's in control, then that horrible thing that just happened to you is sort of his responsibility. So, I think that in some ways, not believing anymore has forced me to be more honest with myself and with others when I'm encountering their struggle. And it's forced me to do something that I think is good to do anyways. And anyone who's watching this, if you're a believer, it doesn't mean you can't do this. I think the most important thing you can do for someone who's struggling is to sit with them. And I mean that sort of literally and figuratively. I think the most important thing you can do is be willing to enter into that pain with them, and to not run from it or pull back from it, to not offer cheap comfort, but to offer something that is real and tangible, and that thing is your own presence, and the willingness to sit in that hard thing with them. And then, I think about that and even the terms I'm using, and it's very easy for me to go well, what's the ultimate expression of that? It's Jesus, And so there, I have a hard time knowing okay, how much of those thoughts are just my Christian upbringing, and I'm just so used to my brain going there, and how much of it is that Christianity is attempting to express ideas that are true in some way underneath, or and that's what I've been trying to get to the bottom of the last 6 months. There's a lot in the Bible that I don't think is literally true, but how many things in it are sort of figuratively or metaphorically true, and I find that I encounter things like that all the time. I mean, do you feel like you encounter that ever, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because even what you were saying before about, like, how you sit with people, and that's the sort of greatest expression. Part of me thought, well, that's almost like the message of Job, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like,
well, kind of. His friends sort of weren't very helpful.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's kind of a lesson on how to be a bad friend.
Because, okay, yeah. Like, what not to do. Yeah.
Like, he's all of his family have died. Like, he's got these horrible boils on him, and within half an hour, his friends are sort of like, okay, what sin did you do? So part of me thinks, like, I think part of the message of that is maybe like what not to do. But I suppose we touched on this a little bit in our last conversation. Is actually the joy, I think, of not believing is that you actually have the freedom to cherry pick and, like, pick and choose.
Yes.
Because there's the point, like you were saying, I think, about how you often hear when it comes to the Bible, like, you can't cherry pick, you can't say I agree with this or not that, and you're like, well, actually you can.
Well, that's the thing, is that we hear that all the time, that, like, oh, well, you can't cherry pick, you can't just take some stuff from the Bible and not others, and not other things, and to which I sort of say, we you're right, we've talked about this before, but I say, like, I think you can. I mean, and B, like, I think you do. I think like, going back to our conversation about heaven and hell, if you believe ardently in eternal conscious torment, then you are cherry picking. If you believe ardently in annihilationism, you are cherry picking. If you believe in universalism, you are cherry picking. And so on so many issues, most of us are already. And so I know that most apologists would say, Christian apologists would say, then, if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to live like that, then how are you grounding your life in any sort of truth, right? That's the question they would ask, because they would say everything at that point is subjective. If you were posed with that question, how would you respond, do you think?
I love it. You see it all the time, and it always boils down to that one. I feel like
it does,
you have a conversation,
yeah.
and then like, I get really annoyed because, like, part of me still loves the whole, like, debate thing, and so I'm like, oh, I've done a really great one here. Like, how are they going to come back?
Sure.
And they're like, I see your point, but how are you grounding that? And I'm like, because I feel like the word subjective seems to bring a real sense of fear to a lot of Christian apologists. Yeah. I feel like there seems to be this kind of obsession with certainty and objectivity, that there has to be, like, an ultimate truth, and that everything is ultimately found within that. I just don't think that's the case. I think, like, the more I've moved away from this sort of Christian understanding, the more I think I've just come to terms and find peace with the idea that actually kind of life just is subjective, like, because it has to be. We're subjects, like, we're people, and therefore the way that we try and understand the world and interact with one another is always going to be from within our own mind, within our own head. Like, there aren't these rules written out as to how we interact with one another. But I think, and here's the thing, I think there is a distinction. I'm not much of a philosopher, so I wouldn't be able to back this up.
I don't know. You sound like a philosopher to me.
Oh, thank you. Don't know if that's a good thing or not, but
I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
Okay. I think there's a distinction between objective and universal.
Oh,
because
okay.
Objective seems to imply that something is factual and outside of a person. So if no one existed, it would still be true because it's objective. Whereas universal still implies subjectivity, but it's like everyone agrees that's the case. So, for example, the idea that murder is wrong, I don't think that's objective, because if there were no people, there'd be no one to decide that was wrong, there'd be no one to kill, all of that. But I do
Yeah.
think it's fairly universal in the sense that we have all arrived at this understanding that it's wrong
Right.
subjectively. But I think, because it probably comes from sort of social and evolutionary realities, I think most people would agree to that. So I would say that there are some things that are and universal doesn't necessarily mean without exception. Like I think
Interesting.
anything that you claim to be universal, there'll be a few outliers. But I think you can have something that's universal, but that doesn't make it objective.
Yeah, I mean, touching on the morality thing we could do a whole podcast just on that, but I've spent a lot of time pondering objective versus subjective morality as well. And I know you and I have talked about it. And I think you made the point at one point, and I thought it was brilliant, that people basically just say objective morality when they, if they say something is objectively wrong, what they mean is, I think it's really, really, really wrong. Or I really think it's wrong, And I'm like, well, that doesn't make it objective. Yeah.
And the thing is that's a huge thing with like a lot of the the apologetics anyway, is it's this confusion of language that's conventional with this idea that it betrays some kind of deeper truth. So for example, if we say something is right or wrong, when I say that, if I say something is right, I'm like, I like that.
Right.
I think
right.
it's, it's a positive thing. Whereas if you have that kind of conversation, you say this is right, then someone says, well, that means you believe in an objective rightness,
right,
or an objective goodness that's based on. I'm like, well, no, that's not what I. It's like if I think something is bad, that's not because I think there is an objective reality of evil to which it conforms. It's more that if someone slaps me in the face, I'm going to feel a bit of pain and realize, oh, that's not something that I like, and therefore I think that's wrong.
Right.
It is quite subjectively decided, but I might use the term wrong just because that's kind of conventional language. But I think when people confuse conventional language for like a more deeply rooted philosophical kind of framework or idea, that's when you get like a lot of miscommunication. And I think that goes on, like you say, with the term objectively, because I've had conversations with people and they've asked me, do you think genocide is objectively wrong? Which I think is, when you get a question like that, I mean, you're never going to.
Oh yeah, I've received that one before, and I usually preface my answer with like, okay, this question is designed to make me look objectively bad.
Yeah.
Right.
There's
because
no way you can come out of it looking good.
Right. So my current sort of feelings about this issue are that I do think morality is completely subjective. But that doesn't mean that anything goes. I think people feel like, oh, if it's subjective, then it doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, well, okay, I have strong feelings about what I think are right and wrong. And a lot of those feelings are shared by most people. Like, I think like murdering a 3-year-old is wrong. And I think most people think that. And so on one hand, you could say, well, like that borders on universal, right? Where like you use the term universal. And I think it gets back to this issue of the fact that like that the words good and bad or right and wrong, they don't mean anything without a reference. Yeah. So it's like if you're trying to say, okay, I have a car and I have a horse, which one is better? If you're trying to get from point A to point B cheaply, reliably, easily, a car is better. If you're trying to participate in a Civil War reenactment, a car is not better.
A car's not going to work so
well. So once you have something to reference, a goal in mind, then you can say, oh, this is good, this is bad, this is better, this is worse, whatever. And I think Christians, what they're doing is the goal is I'm trying to conform to Christian values or a Christian set of beliefs, and that is what I ground that good or bad in. Yeah. And what a lot of atheists will do, or someone like Sam Harris, is he grounds it in human well-being. And so he says, well, what's best for human beings, the best possible thing for the most amount of people, that's what we should ground our moral choices in. Yeah. And I think he's wrong to say that that's objective. I don't agree that makes morality objective. It makes it functionally objective if we can all agree that humans flourishing is good.
Yeah.
right? So then it makes it functionally universal, I guess you could say. This is a good, that's a helpful term. But then I would look at the Christian perspective of objective morality, and what you've just said is that by grounding your morality in God's nature, the problem is, do you know God's nature? And there's wild disagreement as to what that nature is. And even if you read the Bible, there's not a consensus on what God's nature is. So in a sense, like, I just don't think that grounding works functionally. So it's like, do you know, on one side you have a moral grounding that seems to be objective if you're willing to grant the existence of a God that you can know. And on the other side, you have a moral grounding that seems to functionally work, even if it philosophically is not objective. And I'll take that one.
No, definitely. I mean, the problem I think I find is that there's this assumption that if your morality is objective, it's better, and I don't understand that idea at all.
Well, I'll tell you why it's better. It's better because you can hold it over people.
Yeah, well, I think
that's the only reason why objective morality matters. Is it only if you're never trying to hold your moral views over anyone else, then subjective morality doesn't matter. Now, I agree it's a problem because we have to enforce laws. You know, you may be enforcing them in a way that the people you're enforcing them on don't agree. But as a society, you have to have some sort of order and you have to have some sort of law. So I get that you need a functional, at least consensus on what's right and wrong. But I don't think you need it to be built into the fabric of nature the way it would be if it was objective.
Well, that's just, I mean, and the problem is, I think, is like you say, with creating laws, like there's a rationale behind those laws. Like it's not like as soon as something becomes subjective, you sort of just have a hat with a load of morals in and you pick one out and think, okay, today I'm going to be a murderer. Like it doesn't work like that. You have a reason for that. And the problem with what's often called objective morality, but I just, again, I don't know if it's even a helpful term in itself, is it therefore kind of has to be quite arbitrary, because you're saying, well, you just believe in it because it's there. Like you don't have a reason for it, because I've often had conversations with people that say, oh, I really worry if you can have like what your morals are like if you can choose them subjectively. And I think, I really worry what your morals are like if you choose them objectively. Because what you're essentially saying is if God did not say that murder was wrong, you'd be fine with it. Like the only reason that you subscribe to that idea of morality is because like it's been arbitrarily chosen. But then as soon as you start trying to justify it, well, then it becomes subjective.
Yeah.
And so I think actually, like, morality to an extent has to be subjective. And like you say, like even in the Bible, like there's like if you have like an objective morality, how are you understanding that? Like, are you taking it from the Ten Commandments or from the Sermon on the Mount or from like the law revealed like in Exodus and Numbers or from like Paul's epistles? Because they don't all add up. So like, is one of them objective and one of them isn't?
Right.
Like, or is it, I've often heard it said that actually the objective morality isn't even written down, but it's written on our hearts. But
well, it would seem that
which one of those is right.
It would seem that it's written differently on all of our hearts then.
Well, obviously some of them is because sin is involved.
Right. So it's
like
just
the ones that are wrong because sin has implicated.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think I realize that we're talking about, in the title it said divine hiddenness. Well, divine hiddenness, we've talked about a lot of other topics, but divine hiddenness touches all of them, because it comes back to like how, like, if God is real, why is he so mysterious? Why is he so not obviously apparent to us? Why are we disagreeing about fundamental aspects of what his nature would be? Yeah. And it seems to me that the problem of divine hiddenness sort of touches all of these issues in a powerful way. Sometimes someone will ask me, like, if you die and you're faced with God, and you're able to ask one question, what would it be? And my answer is, my question would be, where were you?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a blasphemous question. I think it's an honest one, because I'm not someone who's, and I don't think you are, like, I don't think that either of us are someone that's like on a pissed off crusade to like I'm pissed off at God or anything like that. If God is there, I want to know him. My experiences in my life have led me to a place where I doubt that he is. But I'm continuing to ask questions because it feels like it's really important. And it's also sort of my heritage, my upbringing in Christianity, and the same for you. So yeah, this has been an awesome conversation. And I really appreciate you being here and being willing to be so spontaneous. For all of you watching, I literally reached out to Logan like an hour before we went live, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And I know we got a time difference. I can't remember what time it is for you, but man, thank you for helping me kick off these conversations. And
it's been so fun, yeah.
And
thanks for having me on.
And at some point, we'll have another conversation where we'll actually think through a little more about what exactly we're going to tackle, because we just sort of went ad hoc on this one, but it feels kind of right. But before we go, I kind of just want to maybe give people a quick chance to ask a question. If anyone wants to ask Logan a question, if anyone has a question about anything we've talked about, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to ask questions there. But while we're doing that, Logan, did you have something you were going to say, or?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, like, because when you're saying about how the idea of divine hiddenness kind of touches on everything, I think that's so true. And actually, what's sometimes when I step back from things and just rather than trying to get into like the sort of details about philosophy and theology, I kind of think just the existence of Christian apologetics, I think this almost sounds some like warning bells in my mind, because it does make you think, well, if it's like how, if Jesus was risen from the dead and is alive today, why is so much apologetics about the resurrection focused on like these scraps of documents from 2,000 years ago? Like, surely something from today would have been more helpful. And if there, like you say, if there is a God, he could probably clear up a lot of this stuff. And yet it's kind of left to this sort of discipline that's arisen to try and create an argument for.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think, like you were saying before, like, isn't it interesting that if God did exist, it's entirely plausible, like in the setup of the world that we have at the moment, that he doesn't.
Right.
And I think a lot of apologetics is trying to sort of say, well, no, like there's still a bit of God here and there. And so I think even just the fact that those conversations have to be had in itself kind of testifies to, well, where is God in this? Like, it seems to be that everything that happens to do with the action of God always seems to be mediated through humans and through humanity. And I know that within the Christian view, that's quite a positive thing. Maybe it's this idea of partnership, God works with us. And so that's not actually something that's shied away from. But I think, looking at it from the other point of view, it's like, I understand there are points where that's helpful, but you also think there are other times where it'd be quite nice if he just showed up in a slightly more obvious way.
Yeah, I feel that all the time. I actually, this morning, it's so funny. So I've been studying the New Testament a lot the last couple of weeks, very, very deep dives. And and I've been reading the Gospel of Mark a lot. And I did, and it was the earliest gospel, and it's the most humble. Even though it was the earliest, it was at least 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death that it was written. So there's a lot of time for those stories to develop, and so there's a lot that I'm not sure about. But I found this verse that I've never seen before, and I kind of want to. It relates to divine hiddenness, and so I kind of wanted to read it and get your thoughts. I see a couple questions coming in, but anyone else who wants to ask a question, feel free, and we'll get to them. But I want to read this. I'm going to pull it up here. It's Mark 4, verses 10 through 12. So basically, Jesus has just been telling parables to a bunch of people in public, and then he goes back with his disciples and he's having a conversation with them. And so here's verse 10. And when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables, and he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. So I read that and I go, whoa, 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 whoa. So you're telling me Jesus was using parables so that he could make sure that people didn't understand, because if they understood, they would repent. And he seems to say that,
odd, doesn't it?
He seems to say that that's not a good thing. Now, I went reading and looking for explanations as to why, like, surely Christians have feelings, Christian apologists or theologians or writers have feelings about this verse. I went looking and I found a few sort of thoughts about it, but none of them that were even remotely convincing to me. Yeah. And so that is just a real, have you seen that verse before? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah. Is it from Isaiah? Because he's quoting the Old Testament.
It is. He is quoting the Old Testament, and some of the blogs that talk about it reference that. And basically, their sort of explanation is that there's a desire on Jesus's part for people to believe and have faith before they understand, so that they'll only understand if belief precedes understanding, or something like that.
Yeah.
And
a lot of gymnastics to make that work.
Yeah. And I just kind of go like, well, it comes back to the divine hiddenness question. It's like, well, it seems in this verse that Jesus is saying he's intentionally obscuring the truth from people.
Yeah.
And what I wonder is, whenever there's verses like this, and there are, like you said, in Isaiah and in some of the Psalms, these sort of like, where are you, God verses, I wonder if this is being written by people because they have the same question that I have. If God is real, where is he? So yeah, I do see the irony in the fact that right now in my life, I'm doing the most what could be described as Bible study as I've ever done, and here we are. So, well, let's ask a couple of questions, or let's answer a couple of questions. I think I have the ability to put this on the screen. I've never done this before. Add to broadcast. Yeah. Hey, Chase says, as a former Mormon, you probably can't see it, can you?
No, but that's okay. I can hear.
Okay. Chase Dahl says, as a former Mormon, I'm struggling to figure out the best path to begin my biblical studies. Any advice? So it sounds like, Chase, you're wanting to study Christianity, and you've come out of Mormonism, and I'm not sure exactly what you believe right now, but asking where to start. Do you have thoughts on that, Logan?
It depends, I suppose, on what you want to get out of it and understand. I remember if we were like looking at someone who wanted to believe and asked, where would you start? You'd say like a gospel or something. I always personally thought it'd be really fun to start at the beginning, like go from Genesis through to Revelation, because then you kind of understand that as it goes on. In terms of looking into stuff, the problem is I haven't looked at a lot of like post-Christian literature, because I know that you've sort of got quite a bibliography that you've stacked up of things that you've read into about how to maybe like approach the Bible and faith. But I think for me, actually a lot of the stuff that I like read when I was reading the Bible was just like sort of academic theological stuff, just on different topics. I never really like approached the bigger questions about is the Bible reliable? And honestly, I'm not quite sure. I don't know if I had any specific recommendations if I had to look.
I would say to follow your curiosity, which is what I've done, and go like, what things do you wonder about? So with regards to, leaving Mormonism, like I would actually encourage you to potentially seek out literature outside, written by people outside of Mormonism about Mormonism. Because you've been, probably steeped in Mormon theology and sort of Mormon thought for a long time. And it would be interesting to see other perspectives. So like I've my version of that is I've been reading stuff from people like Dr. Bart Ehrman, who's a really well-known New Testament or biblical scholar, a pretty well-respected one, and he through his studies became agnostic, and so he has a different take on the Bible than someone like William Lane Craig or Dan Wallace or Craig Evans or some of these believers who are either theologians or textual critics. So I would say look for views that oppose the ones you've always held, and see what you think. And I also believe very strongly in this idea from Carl Jung, who is a psychologist, and he said that what you need most is found where you least want to look.
Yeah.
And so, to Chase, I would say pay attention to what you're intimidated by or maybe afraid of, and ask yourself, is there something I'm scared to look at? And something I'm scared to ask, a question I'm scared to ask, and maybe start there. I think that has been a fruitful thing for me. Let's see what other questions we have here. Josh Zach asks, I can put this on here too. In your current spiritual lives, what's the opposite of divine hiddenness? What are the things you feel, experiences you have that let you know you're looking in the right place? That's interesting. So I guess the question is more or less like, what confirms, what are the things that are concrete in your life? Is that more or less the question? I think. I mean, that's kind of more or less how I'm reading it.
Or possibly like, what's an alternative spirituality? Is that kind of thing? So rather than sort of the sort of Christian understanding, because I think for me, and this is an interesting one. I think like nature has more and more recently been like a huge part of my life, I think. And when I was a Christian, I kind of attributed this idea of like beauty to God, and maybe even like that's where I felt like his presence before. Like I thought, if I'm looking up, it's a funny thing, but like the moon, like it seems crazy to me that you sort of look up and you sort of just see it there and you almost take it for granted, but it's thousands of miles away, and it sort of alerts you to how big the universe is, that this thing that's relatively speaking so near yet appears so distant. But I think just that, and just the last couple of years I've been going a lot more on like walks and trying to be a part of nature, and I think it does ground you in something bigger than yourself, because I think that's ultimately what a lot of spirituality and I think a lot of what Christianity in a sense does get at is this idea that actually we're not just ourselves, we're part of something bigger, and I think sort of realizing, especially when we are quite individualistic as a culture and a society, stepping back and realizing that actually, we're not just in nature, we are nature, like we're part of that. That almost is, I suppose, it's the original question. That is kind of almost the opposite of divine hiddenness, or it's kind of like that's the presence. It's this understanding that we're part of this system that is so much bigger than we are just as individuals. Yeah,
and I've actually found a lot of really helpful Buddhist practices. So I actually still like sort of pray in a way. I mean, I sort of put thoughts out there into the universe, or I to God if he's there, because if he's not there, me talking to him doesn't do any harm, I don't think. But I also do a lot of sort of meditative practices, and I can't like sit and meditate for 30 minutes. Like I'm not capable of that, at least not at the moment. But one of the things I do is I do this really, really short meditation, where I if I'm stressed, I can take like maybe like 60 to 90 seconds and do it. And so I'll do it when I'm driving sometimes, or if I just need to take a beat and calm down about something. And so that practice for me is you say these 4 phrases and you focus on the intent of the phrases. And so the first phrase is joyful, energetic body. And I sort of picture my body sort of filling up with energy and joy. And the power of the mind is powerful. I almost start to feel it a little bit when I focus on that thought. And then the second one is loving, compassionate heart. And the third one is reflective, alert mind. And then the fourth one is lightness of being. And I sort of just go through those 4 phrases, and I maybe repeat each one a couple of times and focus on that intention. And I notice after 60 or 90 seconds of that, I'm so much more calm than I was before. And you know, I don't know I don't know that anything is happening other than I'm doing something in my own mind, but it's helpful to me for stress and for just feeling calm. And that's a difference that's really concrete. It's as noticeable as taking aspirin for me, you know?
Right.
So, you know, grounding our spiritual practices and things that really seem to make a difference in our lives. And again, it's like, does it matter if the difference is objective or subjective? No. It might be totally subjective. It might be a placebo, but it doesn't matter.
And I've been quite interested I've been wanting to do meditation basically because I've been looking into Buddhism mainly actually because I'm going to have to teach it in school.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool. Yeah.
So because I'm going to be teaching RE, so I figure I need to know about this stuff. But when I read because so much of Buddhism is about meditation.
Yeah.
And so I thought I kind of want to give it a go. And I've been listening to a podcast called I Can't Believe It's Not Buddha. Which is by Lee Mack and one of his friends, a comedian in the UK. And they've been sort of talking about their experiences and how it's been helpful for them. And yeah, I've wanted to sort of try and do that a bit more. But I think it's, you know, one of the things I often struggled with as a Christian was sort of sitting still in prayer anyway.
Yeah.
So having that sort of just doing nothing. And I sort of had to do prayer as nature walks. In the end, I had to get out and do something. So I feel like it probably is something that does take quite a lot of discipline.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, that's great, man. Well, it's starting to get late probably not late to you. I go to bed super, super early. So it's probably, in your time, it would be past my bedtime. So,
right.
So I'm going to let you go, but dude, thank you so much for doing this. And, I hope we can do it again sometime. And thanks for being willing to participate in this, like, first try at figuring out.
That's exciting.
Everything worked. So yeah. Right, man. Well, thanks for everything. And man, we'll see you again soon.
Yeah. Take care.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.